You never expect the moment that saves your life to look ordinary. It doesn't come with warning lights. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music. Most of the time, it looks like a small mistake, like forgetting your phone at a restaurant table. But for one grandmother in Oregon, that small mistake revealed something she was never meant to see. And what she discovered that night didn't just surprise her. It saved her life. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies we believe are the ones we quietly tell ourselves, and sometimes the truth we need most is hidden in places we almost never look. This is the story of Margaret, a 72-year-old grandmother who believed her life had slowly faded into the background. She believed her most important days were behind her. She believed the world had quietly moved on without her. But one evening, one family dinner, and one forgotten phone changed everything. And if you stay with this story until the end, you might discover something powerful about your own life too, because the truth that changed Margaret's life might be the same truth someone listening to this right now desperately needs to hear. Margaret lived in a small quiet town in Oregon, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where tall pine trees surrounded the streets and the sound of rain tapping on rooftops was almost constant during the winter months. Her house sat at the end of a peaceful road. It was small, simple. But inside those walls lived decades of memories. For 46 years Margaret had shared that house with her husband Robert. They met when they were young, back when life felt wide open and the future seemed full of endless possibilities. Robert was not a rich man. He didn't have a fancy career. But he had something far more important. He had loyalty, he had kindness, and he loved Margaret in a quiet, steady way that never needed grand gestures. He showed love through small things. Fixing the kitchen sink when it broke, leaving her favorite chocolate on the table after grocery shopping. And every morning, without fail, Robert walked into the backyard and watered the roses Margaret had planted years ago. Those roses became part of their routine, part of their life. Margaret used to joke that Robert cared more about those roses than anything else in the yard. But Robert would smile and say something she never forgot. Flowers need care to grow, just like love. For decades their life followed a peaceful rhythm. They raised 2 children, Emily and Daniel. They celebrated birthdays, graduations, family holidays, and even though life wasn't always easy, they faced every challenge together. But one winter morning, everything changed. Robert collapsed in the living room. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. Margaret's world stopped that day. Because when you spend nearly half a century beside someone, their absence leaves a silence that nothing else can fill. First Margaret tried to stay strong. She kept the house exactly the same. Robert's favorite chair remained by the window. His tools stayed in the garage exactly where he left them. She even kept watering the roses. But grief doesn't disappear just because we try to ignore it. It slowly seeps into everyday life. Days begin to feel longer. Nights become quieter. And the spaces once filled with laughter begin to echo with silence. Margaret's children tried to help. Emily called often. Daniel visited when work allowed it. But life had moved forward for them. They had jobs, families, responsibilities, and Margaret didn't want to be a burden, so she started saying the same thing every time they asked how she was doing. I'm fine. 2 simple words, but behind those words, loneliness was growing. Months turned into years. Margaret stopped going to community events. She stopped calling friends. Even her garden slowly began to fade. The roses Robert used to water every morning began to wilt. Not because they couldn't grow, but because Margaret no longer had the energy to care for them. And the most dangerous part of loneliness isn't the silence. It's the thoughts that grow inside that silence. Slowly, Margaret began to believe something that wasn't true. She believed she was no longer needed. She believed her role in the world had quietly ended. She believed her story was already finished. One rainy afternoon she sat by the window watching raindrops slide down the glass. The house felt heavier than usual, too quiet, too empty. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Emily. "Hi, Mom," her daughter said warmly. They talked about small things, groceries, weather. Nothing important. Then Emily said something unexpected. "Mom, we're having dinner together tomorrow night. The kids really want to see you." Margaret hesitated. Being around people after spending so much time alone can feel strange. You begin to wonder if you still belong in those moments. But Emily insisted. "Please come, Mom. It'll mean a lot to everyone." Margaret finally agreed, but she had no idea that simple dinner invitation would lead to a moment that would completely change the way she saw her life. The next evening Margaret stood in front of the mirror getting ready. For a moment she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair was grayer now, her face carried the marks of time, but behind those tired eyes, there was still someone there, someone who had lived. Someone who had loved deeply. Someone whose story wasn't finished yet. Even if she didn't realize it, she put on a soft blue sweater. Robert used to say that color made her eyes shine. Then she grabbed her purse, stepped outside, and drove toward the restaurant. She had no idea that the small decision to attend that dinner would lead to the moment that saved her life. Margaret parked her car outside the restaurant and sat there for a moment before getting out. The lights inside the building glowed warmly through the windows. People were laughing, servers moved between tables, carrying plates of food. For most people, this would feel normal. But for Margaret, it felt unfamiliar. When you've spent too much time alone, even simple moments like walking into a busy room can feel overwhelming. She took a deep breath. Then she stepped out of the car and slowly walked toward the entrance. As soon as she opened the door, a wave of warmth and conversation filled the air. And then she heard a voice that instantly softened her heart. "Grandma!" Her grandson Jake spotted her first. He jumped out of the booth and ran straight toward her. Before she could even react, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist. Moments later her granddaughter Lily followed, hugging her just as tightly. Margaret laughed softly. It was a small sound, but it was real. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep inside. Emily stood up from the table and smiled. "Mom, you made it." Daniel waved from the other side of the booth. "Hey, Mom." For a moment Margaret simply stood there, looking at them, her family, her children, her grandchildren, and something inside her chest warmed in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. They slid into the booth together. Menus opened, drinks were ordered. Small conversations began to float. At first Margaret mostly listened. Jake talked excitedly about a science project he was working on. Lily described the school play she wanted to audition for. Daniel complained jokingly about how terrible his cooking had become since his wife started traveling for work. And Emily watched her mother carefully because Emily had noticed something over the past year. Her mother had grown quieter, more distant. It wasn't something Margaret said out loud, but Emily could see it in the way she spoke. In the pauses between her words, and the way she sometimes stared off into space. Emily had been worried for a long time, but tonight felt different because tonight, Margaret was smiling again. Real smiles, not the polite ones she sometimes used during phone calls. These were genuine, warm, alive. The waiter brought their food. The table filled with plates and conversation, and something unexpected began to happen. Margaret started telling stories. Stories about when Emily and Daniel were young, stories about Robert, about family vacations from years ago, about the time Robert tried to fix the washing machine and accidentally flooded the entire laundry room. Everyone laughed, even Margaret. For a moment, the weight she had been carrying for years seemed lighter, because laughter has a strange power. It reminds us that life still exists in the present moment. Hours passed faster than anyone expected. Eventually the plates were empty, the restaurant grew quieter, families began leaving, and the evening slowly came to an end. Jake hugged Margaret tightly. "Grandma, you have to come to my science fair next month," Lily added quickly. "And my play if I get the part." Margaret smiled. "I wouldn't miss it." Emily walked with her toward the door. "Thank you for coming, Mom." Margaret nodded. "I'm glad I did." And she meant it, because for the first time in months, maybe even years, she didn't feel completely alone. They said their goodbyes in the parking lot. Margaret climbed into her car. As she drove home through the quiet Oregon streets, something felt different. The same roads, the same houses, but inside her mind, there was a small sense of warmth, the kind that only comes from feeling connected again. But halfway home, something suddenly occurred to her. Her phone. She glanced at the passenger seat. Nothing. She checked her purse quickly while stopped at a red light. Still nothing. Margaret sighed softly. Of course. She must have left it at the restaurant. For a moment she considered ignoring it. She could pick it up tomorrow. But something inside her said to turn around. So she did. 10 minutes later she pulled back into the restaurant parking lot. Most of the lights inside were dimmer now. Only a few tables were still occupied. Margaret walked inside again. A young waitress stood near the counter wiping down menus. She looked up and smiled politely. "Hi there. Can I help you?" Margaret nodded. "I think I left my phone here earlier." The waitress walked over to the booth where Margaret's family had been sitting. Sure enough, the phone was lying on the seat. But when the waitress picked it up, she hesitated. The screen lit up again. Another notification, then another. She looked back at Margaret with a slightly uncertain expression. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me mentioning something." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What is it?" The waitress held the phone gently. "It kept lighting up after you left." Margaret frowned. "Lighting up? Messages," the waitress said softly. Margaret unlocked the phone. The screen opened to a family group chat. Curious, she tapped it, and what she saw next made her heart stop. But Margaret had no idea yet that the messages waiting on that screen were about to change everything she believed about her life. Margaret stared at the glowing screen of her phone. For a moment, she didn't breathe. That it was a simple group chat. The one her family used almost every day. She had seen it hundreds of times before. But tonight, the messages were different. They were sent after she had already left the restaurant, messages she was never meant to see. Her finger hesitated above the screen. Then slowly, she scrolled. The first message was from Emily. "Tonight made me really happy. Mom looked happier than she has in months." Margaret's heart tightened. She blinked slowly. "Happier than she has in months?" Another message appeared below it. Daniel had replied. "Yeah, I noticed that too. I've been worried about her." Margaret's eyes widened. "Worried?" She kept reading. Emily typed again. "I think she's been feeling really lonely since Dad passed. I wish we could spend more time with her." Margaret felt a sudden lump in her throat. For months, she had convinced herself that her children were too busy for her, that they had moved on with their lives, that she was simply extra, unnecessary. But the messages on the screen told a completely different story. Daniel responded again. "We need to make more time. She means everything to us." Margaret's hands began to tremble. "Everything?" Another message popped up. This one from Lily. "I love Grandma so much. I hope she knows that." Margaret pressed her lips together. Her vision blurred because for the past 2 years, she had been quietly believing something painful. She believed her presence didn't matter anymore. She believed she had become invisible in the lives of the people she loved. But these messages were destroying that lie piece by piece. Jake sent the next message. "Grandma tells the best stories. Dinner is always better when she's there." Margaret wiped her eyes gently. Her heart was pounding now. The waitress standing beside her watched quietly. She had seen people read emotional messages before. But this moment felt different, because Margaret wasn't just reading words, she was discovering a truth she had never allowed herself to see. Margaret kept scrolling. Emily had sent another message. "I'm going to start bringing the kids over every Sunday. I think Mom needs that." Daniel replied almost instantly. "Not just her. We need it too." Margaret finally lowered the phone. The restaurant around her felt strangely quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen, but inside her mind, something powerful was happening. For years she had been telling herself a story that sounded convincing, a story that explained the silence in her house, the empty evenings, the quiet mornings. That story said, "You're not needed anymore. You've already lived your important years. The world has moved on." But the messages on her phone revealed something different, something she had never allowed herself to believe. She mattered. Her presence mattered. Her voice mattered. Her love mattered. The waitress spoke softly. "Are you okay?" Margaret looked up slowly. Her eyes were wet. But there was something else there now. Something new, something alive. "I didn't know," she whispered. The waitress tilted her head gently. "Didn't know what?" Margaret held up the phone. I thought my family didn't need me anymore." The waitress's expression softened instantly. She pulled out the chair across from Margaret and sat down quietly. "You'd be surprised how many people feel that way," she said gently. Margaret looked down at the screen again. Another message had appeared while she was thinking. This one from Emily again. "Next time Mom comes over, I'm going to tell her how much we love having her around." Margaret covered her mouth. A quiet sob escaped her chest, because in that moment, something painful became clear. For years, her family had loved her deeply, but she had been too trapped inside her own loneliness to see it. Loneliness has a strange power. It slowly convinces you that you're forgotten. It whispers that you're alone. And if you listen long enough, you begin to believe it, even when it isn't true. Margaret looked at the waitress again. "I almost didn't come tonight." The waitress raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Margaret nodded slowly. I thought they were just inviting me out of obligation. The waitress shook her head softly. Those messages don't sound like obligation. Margaret gave a small laugh through her tears. No, they don't. For a moment they both sat there in silence. Two strangers sharing a moment that felt unexpectedly important. Finally Margaret said something she had never admitted out loud before. I almost gave up this year. The waitress froze. Margaret continued slowly. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. She looked down at the table. I started thinking maybe my life had already happened. Like the important part was finished. Her voice cracked slightly. And I was just waiting. The waitress leaned forward gently. Well, it doesn't look like your story is finished. Margaret looked at the glowing phone again. Messages of love, concern, gratitude. All written by the people she cared about most. And suddenly she realized something powerful. The story she had been telling herself was never the truth. It was just fear. Fear created by silence. Fear created by distance. Fear created by the quiet spaces where imagination begins to grow. But tonight, a forgotten phone had revealed something beautiful. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't unnecessary. She wasn't invisible. She was loved. Deeply. The waitress finally stood up. I'm really glad you came back for your phone. Margaret smiled softly. So am I. She placed the phone carefully into her purse, but before leaving she paused. Then she looked at the waitress again. Thank you. The waitress looked confused. For what? Margaret thought for a moment. Then she said something simple. For letting me see something I needed to see. Because sometimes, the moment that saves you, is hidden inside the smallest mistake. Margaret walked slowly out of the restaurant. The night air felt cool and fresh. The parking lot was nearly empty now, but something inside her had completely changed. For years she had been walking through life believing she had become invisible. But tonight, she had discovered the truth, and the truth was powerful. She wasn't forgotten. She was loved more than she ever realized. She sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, and for the first time in a very long time, Margaret felt something she thought had disappeared from her life, hope. But the most beautiful part of this story was still waiting to happen, because the next morning Margaret would wake up with a completely different view of her life, and the small decision she would make that morning would change the rest of her days forever. Margaret drove home slowly that night. The streets were quiet, streetlights reflected softly on the wet pavement, and the town looked almost asleep. But inside Margaret's mind, something was wide awake. The messages she had just read kept replaying in her thoughts. Mom means everything to us. I love Grandma so much. We need to spend more time with her. For years she had believed something completely different. She believed her presence no longer mattered. That the world had quietly moved forward without her. But tonight one small mistake had revealed a truth she had never seen before. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't invisible. She was loved. More than she ever realized. Margaret pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment she sat quietly inside the car. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. The porch light glowing softly, the old wooden steps, the window near the kitchen where Robert used to stand every morning drinking coffee. But tonight something felt different. Not outside, inside her heart. Because something powerful had shifted. Margaret walked into the house and set her purse on the table. Normally this was the moment when the silence would hit her. That heavy quiet that reminded her she lived alone. But tonight, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. Because now she knew something she had forgotten. She wasn't alone in the world. She was part of something, part of a family, part of a story that was still continuing. Margaret walked slowly toward the kitchen window. She looked out at the backyard. And there they were. The roses. Robert's roses. They looked tired, wilted, some branches dry. Leaves scattered across the soil. For the past 2 years Margaret had slowly stopped caring for them. Not intentionally, just gradually. Grief does that. It slowly drains the energy we once used to care about things. Margaret stared at the garden for a long moment. Then she whispered something quietly to herself. Tomorrow. And for the first time in a very long time, she went to bed with a small sense of purpose. The next morning sunlight filled the house. Margaret woke earlier than usual. For a moment she simply lay in bed remembering the messages from the night before. And something warm spread across her chest. She smiled. Then she got up. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee, and stepped outside into the backyard. The air was cool and fresh. Morning birds chirped in the distance. Margaret looked at the rose garden again. She remembered Robert standing here every morning, watering them carefully, talking about how flowers need patience, how they need attention, how they need care. And suddenly Margaret realized something. Those roses were more than flowers. They were a reflection of life itself. When we stop caring for something, it slowly begins to fade. Not because it has no value, but because it hasn't received the attention it needs. And for the past 2 years, Margaret had been doing the same thing to her own life. She had slowly stepped away from the world, stopped reaching out, stopped participating, stopped believing she mattered. But now she knew something different. Her life wasn't finished. Not even close. Margaret walked to the small shed beside the house. She opened the door and picked up the garden hose. Then she walked back toward the roses. The soil was dry, the leaves fragile, but Margaret knelt down and gently turned on the water. The stream flowed slowly over the roots, soaking into the earth, and as she watered each plant, something beautiful happened. Margaret felt something returning to her. Energy, purpose, hope. She wasn't just watering flowers, she was reconnecting with life. Days passed. Then weeks, and Margaret made a quiet promise to herself. She would stop waiting for life to happen. She would start living it again. She began calling her grandchildren more often, sometimes just to hear about their day, sometimes just to tell them a story. Jake invited her to his science fair. She went, and when he saw her in the crowd, his face lit up like the sun. Lily got the part in her school play. Margaret sat in the front row and clapped louder than anyone else. Every Sunday the family gathered for dinner, sometimes at Emily's house, sometimes at Margaret's. The quiet home that once felt empty slowly filled with laughter again. Voices echoed through the kitchen, footsteps ran through the hallway, and the rose garden outside began to bloom again, bright red petals, fresh green leaves, life returning slowly, beautifully. One afternoon months later, Margaret stood in the backyard looking at the roses. The garden looked alive again, colorful, vibrant. And in that moment she thought about something powerful. All of this started with a mistake, a forgotten phone, a simple decision to turn the car around, a message she was never meant to see. And yet, that moment had changed everything, because sometimes the biggest changes in our lives begin with the smallest events, moments that seem ordinary, moments we almost ignore. But inside those moments, there can be truth powerful enough to change the way we see ourselves. Margaret realized something that day she wished she had understood sooner. The lies we tell ourselves can be incredibly convincing. I'm not important anymore. No one needs me. My best years are behind me. But most of the time, those thoughts aren't truth, they're just fear speaking through silence. And sometimes all it takes to break that silence is one small reminder. One unexpected moment. One message that shows you how much you really matter. Margaret looked at the blooming roses again. Then she whispered something softly. Thank you, Robert. Because in a strange way, those roses had reminded her of something he used to say. Flowers need care to grow, just like love. And Margaret realized something else. Love had been around her the entire time. She just hadn't seen it. But now she did. And now she was living again. So if you're listening to this story right now, and somewhere inside you there's a voice whispering that you don't matter, that you're forgotten, that your life has somehow lost its meaning, remember Margaret. Remember the phone she almost didn't go back for. Remember the messages waiting quietly on that screen, because somewhere in your life, there are people who are grateful you exist. Even if they haven't said it yet. Even if you haven't seen it yet. Your presence matters, your voice matters, your story matters, and the most important chapters of your life might still be ahead of you. Sometimes the moment that saves you is already waiting. You just haven't noticed it yet. And if this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Someone who might be feeling invisible. Someone who might be quietly believing the same lies Margaret once believed. Because one small message, one simple reminder, can change a life. And if you enjoy stories that remind us what truly matters in life, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because every week we share stories that inspire hope, courage, and connection. Stories that remind us we're never as alone as we think. Thank you for listening. Take care of the people you love. And never forget this simple truth. Your story is still being written.